Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 22nd of August. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, financial system inquiry confirms the obvious. The Australian economy must be run differently. And let's join the helium-3 energy revolution. So, before we begin, Craig, I just want to make a short announcement that, as we mentioned last week and in previous editions, everything we talk about on this show, people can follow in our weekly publication called the Australian Alert Service. We often have people writing to us saying, "All right, can I get a transcript of that?" That's not that easy, but the Australian Alert Service contains the material that we discussed in this show. So if you haven't had a copy of the Australian Alert Service, you can call in and order it on our toll-free number and get a copy that way, and you can decide later on whether you want to get it on a weekly basis. But I just want to get that pitch in, and so as we go through this material, which is going to be pretty fascinating today, if you want more information, get a copy of this week's Australian Alert Service by calling our toll-free number. All right, so first, financial system inquiry confirms the obvious. The Australian economy must be run differently. And Craig, in the last week, we've had a number of public hearings of the financial system inquiry to coincide with their interim report. And of course, the CEC went along to pretty much all of those hearings. Last week we did report what happened in Melbourne and Perth. Well, since then we've had Sydney and Brisbane public hearings, and we were there. And one of the things that really stuck out at me was that David Murray, who's the ex-boss of the Commonwealth Bank, he's the chair of the inquiry, when it was put to him the kinds of things that we were talking about, such as why we shouldn't bow to the demands for bail-in, right? Why we should have economic sovereignty as a country, why we should have a national bank, he kept saying, well, that is an entirely different, what you're talking about is an entirely different system, and it means the economy of Australia would have to be run completely differently.
Yep,
right?
That's exactly right. That's what we're proposing.
Exactly. So you've got to give him marks for being intelligent enough to see that, right? We're not talking about tweaking the sides here. We're talking about running the economy completely differently. Now, he implies, though, that means Australia would be going it alone, right? That we would, be doing something that's entirely unique and you sort of can't exist in a world like that. Well, that's actually not true, because we're going to go through in quite a bit of detail now the fact that there's an emerging power bloc in the world that we've been talking about recently called the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, and other countries are gravitating to it. That economic power bloc is already equal in size to the combined economic output of the United States and Europe, the dominant transatlantic economies, right? And they are going in the direction that we are talking about, right? Now, we in the CEC in Australia, we've thought this through a lot, and we've been lobbying for it a lot. We work with people like Lyndon LaRouche in the United States and that movement that have been reviving the Hamiltonian tradition of a sovereign credit system there. It's more fledgling in these other countries, right? But it's definitely in that direction.
And what's telling, Robbie, is the fact there's no reporting of this in Australia at all, except for what you hear on the CEC report and in our publications like the Alert Service. But this is seismic in nature, and it is challenging, as you've just mentioned, the very power of the British Anglo-Dutch monetary financial system.
Well, let's just, before we go through some of the actual details, let's just remind people of what it is we're currently in, this Anglo-Dutch monetary system, which you could call the monetary casino. Australia's financial system is part of a monetary casino that's under the yoke of London and Wall Street. Now, that was confirmed in a certain way this week by the Financial Review reported that an ex-ANZ banker named John Darlson, who was a director of the ANZ Bank until the early 2000s, long-time director of the bank, he has written a 139-page submission to the second round of the financial system inquiry that we've been asking all our viewers to make sure you make it. His is 139 pages. And he summed it up in this way. He attacked the interim report saying that it has been written by bankers on behalf of bankers for bankers. And this is a banker by training saying that, right? Now, why was he saying that? Because he highlighted in his submission what we've actually talked about here a lot over the last few years, especially when we've talked about the farm foreclosure crisis, Craig, right? Because we've stated on this program that the banks are starving the productive parts of the economy of credit so they can extract it all and put into their gambling. And their main gambling is in mortgages, right? And the derivatives on those mortgages. He attacked that same thing. Apparently, he's from an old family that's lived in Gippsland since they started hardware in Gippsland in the 1870s or something, right? And as something who holds Gippsland dear to heart, Gippsland region of Victoria, he sees this regional area of a productive part of Australia being starved of credit so the banks can put their money into this. And he highlighted the cause of the scam, which we've also talked about a bit, is a thing called risk weighting, where for some reason it's general practice that when banks lend out money, they keep a little bit in reserve in case some of those loans go bad, right? And that little bit in reserve is called their capital. And so if you lend out $100, you're supposed to keep about $8 in reserve. Well, back a while ago, the governments and the regulators decided that mortgages are not risky like the rest of the economy, and banks could treat half of them, only half their mortgages, as having any kind of risk. And so when they had to keep 8% in reserve, they only had to keep 8% in reserve against half of their mortgage loans, not all of them. Now, for banks, that meant, oh, we can make more money putting money as mortgages instead of other things, right? And then, Craig, in 2004, the regulators dropped that further to 35% instead of 50%. And then after that, at the time of the GFC, they said to the banks, oh, you guys can determine your own risk weighting. And not all the banks, just the big four and Macquarie, right? They can write their own rules in this regard. They've been running an average of 18% risk weighted, which means they hold 8% capital against only 18% of their loans. But I should observe that these loans now, they're making are bigger than ever because the value of housing is greater than ever because of the bubble. So by definition, they're riskier, right? Only been redeemed by the low interest rate. And what it means is if they were motivated to put money into mortgages before, they got no motivation to do anything but nowadays, and that's what he's talking about. And that's an example of the casino nature of the economy, and this is what we're into, this is what the United States, Europe's into. The only thing that's kept it up globally is this money printing of quantitative easing, right? And that's our current system. So, contrast that. What are these BRICS nations doing? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Well, first of all, Russia, which is under huge attack politically by the West, etc., that are trying to sort of blame it for the MH17 disaster and everything else, and so they've been hit with economic sanctions. Russia hasn't skipped a beat. And what they've done instead is they've gone and forged new trade deals, actual deals for physical trade with Egypt, India, and Turkey. They've started organised new food supply arrangements with Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, Paraguay, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Sri Lanka, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Mauritius, Mozambique, and China. Now, this is them saying to the world, look, nation to nation, governments can actually make an economy work, right? Forget this kind of free trade stuff where you just depend on multinationals deciding to do business with you. That's what we can do. Vladimir Putin's economic advisor, Craig, Sergei Glaziev, announced just in the last couple of weeks that Russia is doing something that you used the term before, seismic. This is the really seismic thing. They are actually going with a system of sovereign credit to finance themselves internally. So what he said was they have a plan for fast-track development of the Russian economy on the basis of a new technological order. This plan includes a transition to a sovereign monetary system underpinned by internal sources of credit, an active policy of innovation and support for progress in science and technology. Now, that is a big revolution, right? China already uses sovereign credit in a big way because China is this hybrid economy of, part communist, part free market, etc. So the Chinese government, they've got all these government-owned banks. They make sure they use them, right? You fund this, you fund that, you fund the other. China and Russia sort of working together on this in league with the other sides of these economies that are part of the BRICS things. This can totally take away the power of private banks to indebt countries and then dictate to them, right? Which is why we're calling it a revolution. And I just want to highlight a quote. In one example of this currently in use, just in the last few weeks, both Putin and the President of China have gone to Egypt, and they met with the President of Egypt, al-Sisi, and they've struck deals with him. Egypt, under this new government, has just embarked on this massive project that people probably aren't aware of. They're building a second Suez Canal, and they're funding it entirely internally. They're not borrowing overseas to fund it. Right? They've shifted a huge amount of dirt just in the last 2 weeks as part of this process, and this is an example of this in practice, right? Actually lining up the sovereign credit internally, doing real things with it. And to highlight the sort of the significance of this, in the 19th July Daily Telegraph, a London commentator named Liam Halligan wrote an article called "The Dollar's 70-Year Dominance is Coming to an End," and by that he means the transatlantic US dollar-based system. And he said, quote, "It's long been obvious the BRICS are coming." So, Craig, here's what a lawyer would call a leading question to you. Should Australia stick to the financial casino, or should we go with sovereign credit and real development?
Robbie, we've got a history of using this method, right? Go back to the war years and look what happened.
That's right,
it's our method, right? Yep. This is not a case of something new for Australia. We were able to save our country through the leadership of John Curt and Ben Chifley because we used internal forms of credit through the Commonwealth Bank to mobilise a war economy, and that led to multiple years after the war of great economic development and wealth for our country. Yep. This is not new. What is absolutely despicable and disgusting is that the Australian people are being kept in the dark about these incredibly optimistic developments of a new financial architecture for the sovereign development of nations. No one is being told this.
And what they are being told is tainted with this stuff that Jackie Lambie from the Palmer United Party, spewed out this week, that, we're supposed to think that China's about to invade us or something.
They were going back to the 19th century yellow peril, Robbie, the idea that somehow China represents a threat. China doesn't embark on wars of aggression. That's the British Empire. That's what that's our side. Yeah. Right? And the point is that that was a pretty disgusting comment, but it shows her ignorance on strategic matters. And the same with Clive Palmer. He's got certain interests in China and he's looking after himself here. If you look at it from...
But they said it, except what they said is how the Australian government of both parties has been acting for the last decade at least.
And I think, look, we'll come to in the next segment, you'll get a sense of what actually is at stake here for the world, but also for Australia in terms of the development of helium-3.
Yep. That's true. So we'll take a break now. When we come back, we're going to talk about the scientific side of this revolution. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, let's join the helium-3 energy revolution. Now, Craig, it occurred to me that it's lucky there's no greenies on the moon, because that could interrupt what we're about to talk about.
Well, Robbie, greenies should support fusion.
Well, they should.
That's right.
We'll have to give them classes on it, though.
Well, because they don't know what it is.
No, that's true.
Like most Australians.
Well, no, I don't mean fusion, I mean mining. Because what we're talking about is mining the moon. Yes. So China and Russia have another area of collaboration, which is developing a lunar base to mine an element called helium-3. This has the potential to be the greatest energy revolution in human history, right? And that's because of the massive quantities of energy that can be unleashed through this process called fusion. So currently, Craig, we have fission, the nuclear reactors around the world, 400 or whatever of them are, that are producing a lot of the world's electricity. They're fission reactors, they split atoms. How does fusion work by comparison?
Well, Robbie, just to step back 1 second. I mean, Lyndon LaRouche came out on a webcast and he said, what do you think the most powerful force within the solar system is? And he says, it's the moon, buddy. And I'm thinking, what? The moon's only tiny. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the moon's potential to mine this helium-3. Look, just a quick refresher for people. We've been dealing with fission on the face of the planet for now 70, 80, 90 years, right? And fission is basically where you take a large radioactive element like uranium-235 and you hit it with a slow neutron. And it creates fissionable products and, further huge amounts of energy, right? That's fission. That's a different idea.
The atom splits, and then it splits more, and that's the chain reaction thing that creates bombs, but you can control it for power.
And that's what, many countries are building these fission reactors with huge amounts of high energy available. Now, what we're talking about is fusion. And most people don't know what fusion is because it's slightly different now. But there's two different types of fusion, and I think Ben Dennison from the basement team, LaRouche Scientific team, in this copy of EIR magazine, lays out for people what this fusion actually is and the difference. Now, he talks about two types of fusion. He talks about 20th century fusion and 21st century fusion. And it's important to note that there is a big difference, because the current sort of fusion that most people know about is, well, some people know about, is this fusion that we have with what's called heavy water.
And we're doing experiments on this in places like France, you know, these kind of, to harness this.
Yeah, and look, this fusion is made up of heavy water, and there's plenty of it, right? It's an abundant element where deuterium and tritium are actually brought together in such a way that you have a fusion reaction. You can see this on the screen in this diagram, where you end up with an alpha particle, which is a radioactive particle, and lots of energy, right? But the problem with this is it releases these things called neutrons, and neutron particles are completely well, they can't be contained. You can't contain them with magnetic fields. You can't contain them with electric fields. So this basically can only be harnessed by, again, boiling water, like you've used with coal and other sorts of.
So you have this really high-tech reaction here, but once that's done, the actual process creating power is the traditional one that we've used for 1,000 years.
Yes, so you're sort of limited. You're bounded by this process of literally boiling water. However, that's not what happens with this element called helium-3. And this helium is actually a very stable element, but helium-3 is an isotope which actually has 2 protons and 1 neutron. And what happens is when you bring that together, Robbie, in a fusion reaction, and it takes a bit more energy than normal fusion reactions, is you end up with a lot of energy coming off and 2 of these protons, as you can see in this diagram. Now, what's really important about this is that this immediately moves you away from having to boil water, because those protons, or what we call hydrogen ions, are actually positively charged. So therefore, they can be directed to drive and create electricity through magnetic fields and so forth directly. So you don't have to boil water anymore, so the efficiency goes way up.
Exactly, because in most forms of power generation, there's so much inefficiency because of heat loss. This avoids that.
Yeah. So the point is that on the face of the planet Earth, there's only about 15 kilos of this helium-3. But on the moon, because of the fact that the sun's been throwing it off for billions of years, there's between 1 and 5 million tons of this helium-3. Now,
well, hang on. Hold that thought. We'll take a break. When we come back, you can tell us the scale of why mining there is efficient, actually, to produce energy on Earth. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So, Craig, we're talking about mining the moon for helium-3 that we can use to generate energy on Earth through fusion. There's a lot on the moon compared to Earth, but how much energy can you get out of it? Give people some comparisons.
Well, I think Ben goes through an example for the United States, but I'll make it sensuous for Australians. So because, Robert, we talk about the Murray-Darling Basin, right? And the Murray-Darling Basin has water flows in it down the Darling and Murray rivers. You know, in a drought, it's 5,000 gigalitres, or a gigalitre is 1 billion litre. It dried up in 1902. In floods, it has something like 57,000 gigalitres of water. Now, the average flow is about 24,000 gigalitres, and of that, we take out about 13,000 for use. 11,500 of that is used for irrigation.
All the irrigation.
And so forth, right? Now, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and we've had a big fight over the years about this, wants to pull out 2,750 gigalitres and give it back to swamps to create more swamps, right? Wetlands. Now, what we don't agree with that, but if we were to say, let's put back 3,500 gigalitres, what would that mean in terms of water desalination?
If you desalinated the water instead to put that into the river system.
In order to provide the energy for that, you would only need 150 kilograms, not tons, 150 kilograms of helium-3. Now that's enough, that's less than you and I combined sitting in the back of a car. So you can cart this around in a basically utility. Now, this is equivalent to 3 million tonnes of coal, And if you put that in a train...
150 kilos of helium-3 is equivalent to the energy you get from 3 million tonnes of coal.
If you put that in a train, like a typical train in Newcastle, which is usually carries about 5,200 tonnes, that would mean you'd have to have a train that stretched 600 kilometres full of coal in order to desalinate that 3,500 gigalitres of water. But with helium-3, you only need 150 kilograms of it to create the power necessary to desalinate that water. So that gives you a sense of what the power is of being able to harness these advanced technological processes like fusion.
And this is what we call energy flux density, the density that comes from a new source of energy. The density of energy that's in a new source of energy is what defines if it's a valid energy revolution.
150 kilos of helium-3 versus 3 million tonnes of coal, and forget about solar and wind power.
Yeah.
They don't even feature in this because the energy flux densities of those particular modes of power are so low that you can't even think about doing this. So the interesting thing is that what you've just noticed is with that increase in energy flux density, you open up the potential of whole new processes to be able to refine minerals, to create the power necessary to solve a lot of the problems.
Mine the ocean.
Mine the ocean, desalinate water, as existed, already mentioned, and all sorts of other things. Now, the crucial problem we have, and this is why China and Russia are advancing their space exploration and ability to get into space, is because they see the moon as the necessary resource to solve their problems. Now, China has a lot of very poor people. A lot of its population is poor, and people say, well, why would China spend all this money going to the moon in space exploration when it's got so many poor people? The problem is with China, unless it looks in this direction, it could never lift the quality of life of those millions of Chinese out from where they are now, and they see that as their mode of salvation for the future.
Well, and that's the only way you measure an increase in living standards, Craig, which is energy consumption. It's not how much you can have. Lots of paper dollars in your bank account, but unless you can turn a switch and get electricity on to heat water and cook your food and run a bath and whatever, right? You're not having a very good standard of living. You've got to have energy, and China has 1.4 billion people. It needs energy.
And I think that. Just think about that: 150 kilos of helium-3, which is less than what you and I put together weigh. It would mean.
Well, that's officially.
That's officially, yeah. But the point is that if you looked at that in terms of coal, it's a train that would be the length of 2 Tasmanias topped on top of each other.
Yep.
Now that's the sort of efficiencies we're talking about here.
Yep.
And that it is actually mind-blowing, and I think people really need to get a sense of this by having a look at some of this material on the website, particularly on the LPAC website, and get a sense of what is actually possible, and the fact that the BRICS nations are committed to this high technology.
Yeah, so contrast Obama, who is actively shutting down America's space program. They are building it up so they can achieve these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, China wants to have 2,000, specialists in nuclear physics by the year 2020. 2,000.
Yep.
How's Australia going in that respect?
Well, look, people can, like I said at the beginning, if you want more information on this, you can call in and order a copy of this week's Australian Alert Service, which includes the Ben Deniston article that Craig's been referencing. In other words, otherwise it's an excellent product anyway to follow these developments along. But apart from that, that's the contrast. What we talked about, you either have a casino economy, or you can have one that is committed to economic development, and we in the CEC are fighting for that one committed to economic development. So, Craig, thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching, and tune in next week for more CEC Report.